Hey guys, tonight we're not sneaking through dungeons or tracing the embroidery on a queen's sleeve. Tonight, we're stepping into something quieter, but far more dangerous. The floor beneath you is cold stone, slightly uneven, worn smooth by generations of slippered feet pacing in worried thigh. The air smells like old incense, mildew, and something metallic, like the whisper of iron shackles in the distance. You're not imprisoned. Technically, you're just married. And that's close enough. There's a ring on your finger, but no sparkle in your eye. You're bound, not blessed. And what's worse, everyone around you thinks that's how it should be. Your mother says, endure it. Your priest says, God wills it. Your neighbors say, at least he doesn't beat you in public. But your body says, no. Your soul says, enough. You're starting to wonder, is there a way out? You probably won't survive this. By the way, not if you get caught. Not if your husband's family has money. Not if the priest decides your bruises were provoked. This isn't modern heartbreak with therapy and brunch after. This is medieval Europe. And walking away from a marriage could cost you your land, your children, your name, or even your life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly soothing to imagine all of us stretched out across the globe, cozy in our beds, whispering through history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You aren't supposed to leave. Marriage in medieval Europe isn't just a sacrament, it's a sentence. Once you're in for life. The church calls it indissoluble. That means unbreakable, not just in God's eyes, but in legal terms too. There's no divorce as you know it. No clean papers. No irreconcilable differences. It's a one-way road with no off-ramp. Unless someone dies. And even then, they better stay dead. So when you, a medieval woman, wake up one morning and think, I cannot do this anymore, you're already entering dangerous territory. Because this thought, this tiny flickering, candle-sized rebellion, it's enough to burn everything down, your reputation, your family alliances, your soul in the eyes of the church. And yet, some women did it anyway. You begin to notice the signs. The woman at market who suddenly wears black, though her husband isn't dead. The noble woman whose husband has gone on pilgrimage for the 6th year running. The laundress who no longer lives in the village, and whose name the priest avoids in sermons. These are not accidents. These are women who walked away, or were pushed so far, they had no choice but to leap. The church tries to make sure you never get this idea. From the pulpit, the priest reminds everyone that Eve caused the fall, that Jezebel lured men to ruin, and that wives should submit to their husbands in all things. But behind closed doors, there are whispered stories of women who made it out. You start asking questions, carefully. What happened to Lady Cecily? You ask the baker's daughter. She shrugs. She said her husband was the devil, said she'd rather face God's judgment than sleep beside him again. You file that away. It's not much, but it's something. Historians still argue whether most medieval women truly believed in the sanctity of marriage, or if they just had no other choice. What's clear is this: the moment a woman even thought about leaving, she entered a maze of danger, gossip, and, strangely, creativity. You'd be surprised how inventive desperation can be. You hear tales of a merchant's wife who disappeared into the forest with a traveling tinker and was never found. Of a milkmaid who dressed as a boy and became a cook in a monastery kitchen, of a baroness who faked a vision from Saint Apollonia to win separation from her husband, claiming divine instruction. Apollonia, by the way, is usually invoked for toothaches. But who's going to argue with a saint? Here's the first thing no one tells you. Medieval women did leave. Not many, not easily, and not often with a happy ending. But they did. And every time one of them did, she tore a little hole in the tapestry of expectation, just wide enough for the next woman to crawl through. It's a dangerous thing to want freedom when your world is built to contain you. But tonight, you're going to learn how some women found the exits, and what they lost or gained along the way. And as you lie back, warm under your blanket, listen closely. Not every footstep is a man returning home. Sometimes it's a woman walking away and never looking back. Your marriage, you realize, was never about love. Not really. It was about land, or wool, or a border dispute settled with your womb as collateral. You weren't asked if you liked him. You were asked if your dowry was intact, and if you could bear children. Bonus points if your father threw in a few sheep, a vineyard, or the rights to a toll bridge. You remember your wedding day. You stood still, careful not to trip on the hem of your stiff gown, the weight of a borrowed veil tugging your scalp. The church smelled like wax and damp wood. Your groom smelled like turnips and ambition. And when the priest said, "Till death do you part," no one winced, except maybe you. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't a sacred love bond between two hearts. It was a contract, a legal agreement, a transaction that handed your body, your labor, and your obedience to another household. Your husband didn't marry you. He married your value. And if you thought noble women had it easier, think again. The stakes were just fancier. If a peasant girl was married off to combine plots of barley, a noble daughter was wed to strengthen the claim on Gascony or prevent her cousin from starting another war over sheep grazing rights. Sure, you got better wine at your wedding, but your freedom was equally disposable. You live in a time when your name disappears upon marriage, not just figuratively, but legally. You're now wife of. Your identity gets absorbed like broth into stale bread. And leaving? That's not just walking away from a husband. It's breaking a chain that the law, the church, and your family have spent years wrapping around you. Still, some clever women fought back before the ring even slipped onto their finger. Take prenuptial contracts. Yes, they existed, especially in regions like Italy and southern France, where Roman law still had a heartbeat. These contracts outlined dowry terms, household rights, and even what would happen if the marriage failed, a word no priest would say out loud, but lawyers had no issue scribbling into parchment. Historians still argue whether these contracts truly protected women or merely safeguarded male interests. Either way, they were loopholes in the locked room of matrimony. Let's say your dowry included a vineyard. If your husband mistreated you or squandered it, some contracts allowed you to retrieve what was yours. Not freedom exactly, but leverage. And in the Middle Ages, leverage was everything. You learned to read these contracts the way some people read omens. If a clause says, "You keep your dowry in the event of abandonment," you nod slowly. Abandonment can be arranged. So can evidence of it. A few witnesses. A priest who owes your uncle a favor. And boom, he left you. Congratulations. You're not divorced, but you might be rich and miserable instead of poor and miserable. Then there's marriage by proxy. Yes, that was real too. In cases where grooms couldn't attend the ceremony, they sent a stand-in, often a friend, sometimes a brother. There's a recorded case where the groom was a sword, literally held by the stand-in to represent the absent man. You stood there, vowing obedience to a piece of steel. Not exactly romantic. Here's the twist. If the real groom turned out to be unacceptable, physically, politically, or financially, you had a narrow slit of time where you could protest, say he was leprous, or already secretly married, or cursed by a wandering nun. That might void the match. That might be your chance. You begin to realize how much medieval women had to understand legal nuance, social subtext, and theatrical timing just to survive marriage, let alone escape it. And remember, many of these women weren't educated. They couldn't read Latin, but they knew the village gossip circuit. They knew how to weep in front of the right people, how to look frail in front of the bishop, and terrifying in front of their husband's cousin, who couldn't stop staring. Intelligence took many forms. Of course, sometimes even a perfect contract couldn't save you. There's the story of Ermengarde of Anjou, married off to a nobleman, then cast aside when he decided she wasn't strategic enough. She spent decades trying to get recognition of her marriage's validity, appealing all the way to the Pope. Did she win? Depends how you define winning. She got legal acknowledgement. She did not get her life back. Then there's another story, less famous, but no less real. A woman in Cologne, Germany, tried to argue her marriage should be voided because her husband was incapable in the bedroom. She brought in witnesses. He brought in threats. The court ruled in his favor. She was last seen boarding a ship with a merchant crew headed east. You imagine her standing at the prow, wind in her hair, the stink of fish everywhere, and for the first time in years, hope. Not everyone got that ship. And still, not everyone waited to be allowed to leave. They simply ran. But you're not there yet. You're still playing by the rules, reading the fine print, watching for the loopholes in lace and Latin. Marriage is a business deal, sure, but maybe, just maybe, you're about to become the better negotiator. You've been watching, listening, learning, and now you know. If the front door of marriage won't open, you find a side window. Maybe it's barely a crack, but you'll squeeze through it anyway. And that crack? It's called annulment, unlike divorce, which suggests a marriage ended. An annulment says it never really existed in the first place. Not properly. Not sacramentally. The church doesn't believe in takebacks, but they do believe in technicalities. And medieval women? Oh. They became experts in the art of technicality. You walk into the consistory court with your veil tugged forward and your story rehearsed. We were too closely related. You whisper, eyes wide with innocence. Or, he was already married when we wed. He just forgot to mention it. Or the classic, we never consummated the marriage. Boom. Door creaks open. You'd be surprised how often that last one worked. Non-consummation was a legal basis for annulment, though proving it was awkward at best and humiliating at worst. Some courts demanded the woman be examined by midwives. Others just wanted sworn testimony from servants about bedsheets, noises, or the lack thereof. Quirky tidbit. In one case in 12th century France, a woman claimed her husband was actually impotent because he had been cursed by a goose. Yes, a goose. He supposedly kicked it while drunk and never rose to the occasion again. Historians still argue whether this was a metaphor or just very unfortunate poultry. In some regions, especially Italy and Aragon, Annulments weren't rare, just expensive. Wealthy families used them to reset alliances. If the groom's inheritance dried up, or if the bride's brother joined a rebellion, the marriage suddenly became invalid. It's amazing what a few gold florins and a letter to Rome could accomplish. But for regular women like you, it's trickier. You might find a sympathetic priest who knows your husband spends more time with ale than with you, or a bishop who owes your uncle a favor. You start weaving your case carefully, gathering tiny bits of truth and spinning them into persuasive fictions. You claim you were underage at marriage. True. Technically, though so was everyone. You claim you were coerced. Easier to argue if your father is dead and can't contradict you. You claim spiritual incompatibility. Your husband mocks the saints. You insist, or worse, speaks fondly of the Cathars. Cathars, by the way, were a heretical group who believed marriage was a worldly trap and that true holiness meant chastity. If you say your husband is halfway to heresy, people listen. Not because they care about your suffering, but because they hate heretics more than they hate disobedient wives. Some women went even further. They staged elaborate performances. One record from England tells of a woman who entered the consistory, dragging her wedding dress behind her, torn and soaked in pig's blood. She cried that her husband had defiled her, cursed her womb, and stolen her honor. The judge reportedly vomited. She got her annulment. But not all stories end that well. In Paris, a young woman named Alice petitioned for annulment on grounds that her husband was possessed. She said he barked in Latin at night and refused to sleep on a bed, only in a barrel. She had one neighbor testify. The court ruled she was hysterical and ordered her confined to a convent. That's the risk, because while annulment is a possible path, it's a tightrope over a pit of thorns. One wrong word, one judge in a bad mood, and you're not a clever strategist. You're a liar, a temptress, a lunatic, and you'll be punished accordingly. And yet, women kept trying, sometimes with success, sometimes with scandal. Remember Queen Margaret of Scotland? She sought an annulment from her husband on the basis of consanguinity. They were too closely related by blood. Never mind that it had been known from the start. The real reason was political, of course. The annulment was granted, and Margaret went on to marry again. Happily? No, but with slightly more agency. Then there's Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, that Eleanor, who wrangled a separation from the King of France, citing lack of a male heir and general incompatibility. He didn't love her. She didn't love him. She got the annulment, and then she married Henry Plantagenet and became Queen of England. Not exactly a retreat into obscurity. But you're not royal. You don't have armies or popes on speed dial. You have bruises no one will name, a priest who sighs when you approach, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, the system will bend. Historians still argue whether annulment was a real path to freedom or just an illusion, something dangled before desperate women to keep them obedient. But what's undeniable is that some women did use it. Some walked into court wives and walked out. Legally, nothing. It was a victory of absence, a declaration of self through subtraction. You lie awake that night, heart pounding, words rehearsed again and again in your mind. You wonder if you should fake a vision, or a nosebleed, or say you were bewitched. You wonder how many lies you'll need to get to the truth, that you shouldn't have to stay, and somewhere in the dark, another woman is wondering the same thing. The church doesn't care if you're miserable. That's the first thing you notice when you finally stand before the ecclesiastical court. Your veil pulled back just enough to reveal the exhaustion in your eyes. You aren't here for sympathy, you're here for a ruling. And this court, it's not interested in your feelings. It's interested in sacraments. Marriage, they remind you, is holy, indissoluble, permanent. It mirrors the bond between Christ and his church, which is poetic, perhaps, but also terrifying, because the church doesn't break up with Christ. Ever. Your husband, of course, isn't in court. He's probably at the tavern or out hawking, or maybe sulking in the manor because you've dared to cause a scene. Men rarely have to show up. They send a steward, or a priest friend, or a piece of parchment with a signature shaped like a drunk worm. You, however, must be present. You must sit there while they ask how often you prayed for him, whether you denied him your body, whether your soul still belongs to him. Spoiler, the answer is always yes, unless they want to trap you for lying. You try to answer carefully. I prayed for him often, you murmur, though what you actually whispered were curses beneath your breath while grinding millet. I did not deny him, you say, which is true. You were there, under him, trying not to cry. My soul. You pause. My soul is still my own. Wrong answer. They frown. Historians still argue whether these church courts were genuinely fair or merely theatrical shams. Some records show judges taking female complaints seriously, especially when abuse was obvious or the husband had other enemies. Others reveal a brutal bureaucracy, proceedings delayed for months, witnesses mysteriously unavailable, women forced to produce evidence that no one wanted to see. Let's be clear, this isn't a courtroom like in a modern TV drama. There's no jury, no pounding gavel. You're in a stone chamber that smells of damp parchment and overcooked candle wax. The judge is a cleric, not a magistrate. He wears robes, not robes and a wig. His decisions are written by scribes who occasionally fall asleep while copying, which leads to lovely flourishes of legal nonsense in the margins. Once, a doodle of a bishop riding a snail. Quirky, yes. Reassuring? No. You notice that male petitioners, the rare few who do ask for annulment, are treated with more possibility. A man who claims his wife is unchaste is believed. A woman who says her husband beats her, she's emotional. Still, you persevere. You've gathered witnesses. The neighbor who heard screams through the walls. The midwife who treated your bruised ribs. The priest who, reluctantly, admits your husband sometimes arrives to confession in a temper. They testify, eyes lowered, voices trembling. No one wants to be too bold. Even truth-tellers can be punished. Sometimes, you think, you're not just on trial for leaving, you're on trial for speaking at all. One woman you met in the waiting room told you her husband dragged her through pig slop after dinner. When she petitioned for separation, the judge asked why she made him angry. Another said her husband gave her devil marks, burns shaped like coins along her arms, but the court ruled they were punishment for her own sins. You begin to realize cruelty isn't always grounds for separation. But scandal might be. So, in some cases, women played to the crowd. You've heard of Lady Matilda of Flanders, who walked into court carrying the broken frame of her marriage bed. She dropped it in front of the judge and said, "This is the only thing he ever touched." He was a monk. She claimed, by preference, not vocation. She won her case. In another town, a woman cut off her own hair, smeared her face with soot, and marched through the square screaming that her husband had left her cursed. The crowd gathered. The court, fearing unrest, granted a temporary separation. Sometimes, embarrassment did what righteousness could not. But not every woman could afford theatrics. Most had to whisper their pain, one syllable at a time. The consistory court, named after the word consistorium, meaning council, is both your chance and your trap. It offers women like you a voice, yes, but only within strict rules. If you cry too much, you're hysterical, too little, and you're unfeeling. If you speak plainly, you're disrespectful. If you quote scripture, you're presumptuous. It's like being judged on a play you never agreed to perform, on a stage you didn't build, before an audience that already wants you gone. And yet, some women win. There are scrolls, yellowed with age, where a clerk records marriage dissolved by ecclesiastical authority, grounds, fraud, or annulment granted due to prior betrothal, or even separation sanctioned due to persistent cruelty. They're rare, but they exist. They are, in some ways, sacred texts of female persistence. You dream of one with your name on it, but tonight, you sit and wait. The judge mutters to his assistant. The assistant glances at your face, then at your veil, then back at the ledger. You think you hear the word inadmissible. You bite your lip to keep from shaking. If they deny your case, you'll have to return to him, to his fists, to his silence, to that heavy breath in the dark. Or you'll run, or disappear, or die. You wonder which option the church would consider the most sinful. She speaks too much. She marries too many times. She is loud, ribald, and far too proud of her red stockings. And yet, there she is, immortalized on parchment, strolling through Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with her wide hips and 5 dead husbands trailing behind her like ribbons. The wife of Bath. You've heard of her. Everyone has. She isn't real, exactly. But oh, she might as well be. In a world where women are expected to be silent, she is a trumpet. Where wives are supposed to submit, she boasts of domination. And where most medieval women disappear into footnotes after marriage, she builds her entire identity through her marriages and outlives every one of them. You hate her, you you envy her, because somehow, even in fiction, she carved out power where there shouldn't have been any. You sit with the other women while the court takes a break, and someone jokes. Maybe you should take a page from the wife of Bath, marry 5 times, collect 5 inheritances, and retire with a vineyard. You smile politely, but deep down, you're wondering what her secret was. Here's the truth. Chaucer may have written her as satire, but he wasn't making her up from scratch. Medieval Europe did have bold, strategic, calculating women, especially widows, who had tasted the chains of marriage, watched them fall away at death, and decided never to wear them again. They remarry only when it benefits them. They use the marriage market the way a knight uses a lance. One such woman, real and stubborn, was Marjorie Paston of the famous Paston Letters. She didn't walk away from marriage, but she wrote like she wanted to. In her letters, she complains about her husband's bad decisions, her in-laws meddling, and her endless labor keeping the estate together while the men blunder through lawsuits. She's not funny like the wife of Bath. She's exhausted, but she's loud. And that matter more. Then there's Christine de Pizan, writing not as a wife but as a widow. After her husband's death, she refused remarriage, instead becoming one of the first professional female writers in Europe. Her book of the City of Ladies is a polite punch in the face to every man who claimed women were naturally inferior. Christine didn't walk away from marriage. Death did it for her, but she stayed away by choice, and she thrived. Historians still argue whether these women were outliers or representatives of a quieter rebellion among literate wives and widows. Were they exceptional, or were they just the few whose words survived? Back in your reality, you're not writing treatises or sonnets. You're scrubbing laundry and surviving one meal at a time, but that doesn't mean you're powerless. You start noticing the little ways women around you express resistance. There's the baker's wife who hides silver pins in her bodice, her own small dowry, saved away one coin at a time. The candlemaker's daughter who refuses to marry her father's chosen groom and takes sanctuary in the church for a week, daring the men to drag her out. The herbalist who teaches girls how to make teas that delay conception, not prevent. Mind you, that would be sinful, just delay. They're not walking away from marriage, but they're not fully inside it either. You begin to wonder if freedom doesn't always come from escape. Maybe it sometimes comes from remaking the role, bending it like a reed, whispering beneath it until it hollows out from within. Because the truth is, some women could manipulate the institution to their benefit, wealthy ones, literate ones, widows with leverage. They could control property, negotiate terms, even arrange future remarriages before their current husbands hit the grave. One widow in 14th century France reportedly outlived 3 husbands, negotiated 2 dowries for her daughters, and still retained ownership of a vineyard complex. Local boys called her the Black Widow, not for murder, but for power. Power, you realize, is often assumed to be loud, but sometimes it wears an apron and counts every chicken leg after dinner. You start reading faces differently? That quiet woman at church with the 3 sons and the mysteriously absent husband? Maybe she's not mourning. Maybe she's managing. That grandmother who insists girls shouldn't learn Latin? Maybe she did. Once. And regretted what she read. The wife of Bath says, "Experience, though no authority in this world, is right enough for me." She claims she'll wed again if she wants, and love who she pleases. She talks about sex and gold and power without shame. She laughs at men who try to tame her, and while most medieval women could never afford to be her, many learned to channel parts of her. When you walk into the next hearing, you imagine her beside you, loud, painted, vulgar, alive. She wouldn't ask for permission. She'd make the bishop blush and the scribe drop his quill. You won't be her, but you remember her, and that's enough to hold your spine straighter, because sometimes walking away doesn't mean vanishing into the woods or faking your death. Sometimes it means staying loudly, inconveniently, brilliantly yourself, until the cage opens on its own. The court chamber is quieter now. The morning's dramatics have given way to paperwork and yawns. Someone's snoring gently in the back pew, but you're wide awake, because now it's your turn to be heard, and you're not the only woman here hoping for a miracle wrapped in red tape. You're in the consistory court, a space that feels like the moral version of purgatory. Not quite justice, not quite mercy, just a dim-lit room where your future is decided by men who think matrimony rhymes with mortification. This is where women bring their pain in bundles, testimony wrapped in linen, bruises hidden beneath modest cloaks. Your hands are cold, not from fear, from the waiting, and then you're called forward. You're not alone in this room. Behind you sit women just like you. Ahead of you is the court cleric, half bored, half judging. To the left is your husband's cousin, sent as proxy, wearing the smug expression of someone who's never done laundry in his life. You clear your throat. The room doesn't look up, but the scribe does. That's something. You begin with facts, names, dates, the day he locked you outside in the snow, the evening he poured mead on your lap because dinner was late, the silence that grew so large between you it became its own third person in the house. You hope they hear you. You really do. But this isn't a modern court. Remember, this is about souls, not scars. The judge listens, but for the wrong things. He doesn't ask, what did he do? He asks, did you provoke him? He doesn't say, are you afraid? He says, have you considered the children? You want to scream that you are considering them. That's why you're here. But instead, you say, I have prayed. I have endured. I can no longer. It lands like a whisper on stone. Still, sometimes stone cracks. You think of other women who've stood here before you. Women whose cases turn not on evidence, but on performance. And so you modulate your voice. Let it tremble. Not too much. Just enough. There's a reason some women rehearse their testimonies like plays. Because in these courts, emotion is currency. Too little. And you're cold. Too much. And you're hysterical. It's an impossible scale, balanced by clerics who've never held a crying child or wiped blood from a hearth. You mention the bruises. He denies them, of course. He always does. She bruises easily. His cousin shrugs. She fell once while sweeping. You resist the urge to say, down the stairs? Instead, you present your witness, the midwife who saw you after the beating. She's old, her hands knotted like tree roots, her eyes milky, but she speaks clearly. Her ribs were tender. The skin was blackened. I asked her what happened. She wept. It's not damning, but it's real. And that matters. Historians still argue whether these courts were stacked entirely against women, or whether, in some regions, they offered genuine refuge. Records show surprising pockets of leniency, particularly in cities like Bologna, Avignon, and York. Local customs, a bishop's personality, even the weather, all could shift the outcome, and in some cases, women won. There's a record from 1321 of a woman in Siena whose husband attempted to sell her into debt servitude. She not only got a legal separation, but was awarded custody of her younger children. Another, in Norwich, proved that her husband hadn't supported her financially for over 6 years. The court ruled in her favor and ordered the return of her dowry, a small miracle, sealed in wax. Of course, for every victory, there were a dozen denials. Some women were declared rebellious, others delusional. One unfortunate soul in Bruges was excommunicated for undermining the sanctity of her vows. Her crime? Telling the priest her husband smelled of brimstone and jealousy. But you're holding steady. You know the game. You quote scripture just once. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. You let that hang. You don't say the rest. You don't need to. And then you sit and you wait. Again. Hours pass. Your stomach aches. The ink dries on a page you're not allowed to read. And then the judge speaks. Separation, not annulment, he says flatly. On grounds of cruelty. No remarriage permitted. Your heart thuds. It's not freedom, but it's not nothing. Legal separation. It means you don't have to live with him. You're not free, but you're elsewhere. You can keep your name. Maybe a portion of your dowry. Maybe a plot of land. maybe even your sanity. You exhale. It tastes like iron. Because now, you must figure out how to live as a woman, neither wife nor widow. You'll be watched, judged, perhaps even mocked. But you'll be safe. That's a start. And as you leave the courtroom, you glance back, just for a moment. You half expect to see the wife of Bath lounging in the corner, winking, or a nun smiling softly behind her wimple, but it's only you, and your shadow, longer now, steadier. You didn't win, exactly, but you didn't lose. You try not to flinch when the priest says it aloud. He beat her, yes, but was it justified? That word, justified, hangs in the air like sour smoke. You're sitting in a pew, not for your own case this time, but as a witness, a neighbor girl, barely 17, married to a cooper who thinks beer and bruises go hand in hand. She's crying now, not from fear, but frustration. She knows what happened. So do we all. But that doesn't mean anyone's going to believe her. Because here's the secret you've already learned. Medieval courts rarely asked. Did he hurt you? They asked. Did you deserve it? You can't scream. You can't even sigh too loudly. But inside, your bones are boiling. Welcome to the messier truth of medieval divorce. Not the legal loopholes. Not the poetry of the wife of Bath, but the raw, ugly reality of trying to leave a violent man in a world that thinks he owns you. Cruelty was one of the few recognized grounds for separation in ecclesiastical law. Not annulment, mind you, but legal separation. The kind where you were still technically married, but allowed to live apart. No new husband, no new life, just the absence of pain, if the court believed you. Which often, they didn't. You remember your own hearing, the way the judge tilted his head when you mentioned the bruises, the way the scribe looked bored when you spoke, the way your husband's cousin kept smirking, as if the whole thing was just theater. Historians still argue whether cruelty was too vague a term to be enforceable, or whether it was simply wielded by courts more interested in social order than justice. Some suggest that medieval definitions of cruelty were narrower than we'd expect. It had to be malicious, repetitive, and visible. And even then, doubt crept in like mildew. That meant women had to get creative. One woman in 13th century Milan hired a local artist to sketch her injuries, bruises on her arms, cuts on her back. She presented them to the court like a saint showing stigmata. The priest refused to look, said images were dangerously close to vanity. Another in Bruges walked into court holding a bloodied nightgown. Not mine, she said. His. I finally hit back. She didn't win her case, but her husband left the city shortly after. No one saw him again. Some women brought witnesses, servants, neighbors, even children, but testimony could backfire. She screamed like a demon, one neighbor might say, trying to help, but instead feeding the idea that the wife was mad or possessed. Courts were notoriously suspicious of female emotion. Tears could mean manipulation. Calmness meant coldness. There was no winning tone. And still, some women won. There's a case from 1374 in Ghent. A woman named Leni claimed her husband beat her with a branding iron after she spilled soup. Her neighbor corroborated it. So did the village priest. The judge granted her a legal separation and her own home. It wasn't freedom, but it was space. Then there's the case in Avignon, where a woman argued that psychological cruelty, constant threats, screaming, isolation, was equally damaging. The court took months, but in the end, they agreed. She was allowed to leave. The bishop called it divine compassion. But for every line, there's a dozen unnamed women whose bruises faded faster than their hope. You start to notice the quiet codes in your village. A woman who walks with her eyes always lowered, not modesty, just fear. A wife who wears long sleeves in summer, not vanity, just hiding. A husband who always arrives to Mass with a different excuse for why his wife stayed home. That's not coincidence. And so, whisper networks form. Women tell women how to hide money, how to cry just enough, how to word your petition, how to survive until the moment you can run, beg, or manipulate your way free. Sometimes protection came not from the court, but from the convent. Nunneries could offer sanctuary, even to married women, especially those fleeing abuse. It was an imperfect solution. You lost nearly everything, including your freedom to remarry, but you gained peace, silence, safety, bread baked without the taste of dread. You think of the girl beside you now, still sobbing, her hand shaking as she signs the petition parchment. Maybe she'll get her separation, maybe not, but either way, she's done something powerful. She's named it. She's spoken aloud what others still whisper. There's power in that. You remember something your grandmother once said, a bruised arm heals, a silenced mouth takes longer. She was right. As you leave the court that day, you don't feel triumphant. You feel tired, but underneath that, a small flicker of resolve. You've seen what courage looks like. Bloodied, tear-streaked, still standing. You carry it home like a borrowed candle. And maybe, just maybe, someone will see that flicker through their own darkness. You sleep in your own bed now, not because the church annulled your marriage, not because your husband is dead, but because the court gave you what's called a separation from bed and board. That means you're still legally married. No other man can touch you. Not without damnation and scandal, but you don't have to share your life with the one you married. It's a strange kind of freedom. Bitter, but real. Your house is smaller, quieter. You've moved back in with your brother and his wife, sleeping in the storage loft beside sacks of grain and a trunk full of someone else's linens. Your name is spoken with care, like it might break if said too loudly. But you are not broken. You're rearranged. This arrangement, separatio immensa et thoro in Latin, was the church's compromise, a way to acknowledge pain without rewriting their theology. You can live apart. You can keep property, sometimes even children, but you may never remarry. Your marriage is still considered valid in the eyes of God. You're simply exempt from the bed and the board, and in medieval society, where a woman's worth is often measured by the man she serves or buries, being in this legal limbo makes you dangerous. People don't know what to do with you. You're not a wife? Not quite. Not a widow? Not yet. You wear no black veil? Light no candles for the dead? You're a walking contradiction. Unmarried yet unavailable. Your hair isn't covered like a maiden's, but you also can't wear the bridal keys anymore. So instead, you wear ambiguity. You become your own category. Historians still argue whether legal separation empowered medieval women or simply confined them in new ways. Some say it was a progressive step, offering women a legitimate alternative to enduring cruelty. Others argue it was a trap, another tool to preserve patriarchal order while seeming merciful. You've decided not to care what scholars think, because you know how it feels. You know what it's like to walk to market and hear silence fall around you like a curtain, to see wives avert their eyes, husbands glance twice, and elders murmur just loudly enough to be heard. She couldn't endure. She left. She thinks she's better. You buy your barley, and keep walking. Because what they don't say, the part they leave out, is that you survived, and so do other women. You begin to notice them. The spinster who never married, who tends herbs and sells tonics no one dares ask about. The widow who rents rooms only to single mothers and always accepts bread as payment. The nun who doesn't flinch when you ask for help writing a letter. Together, you make a kind of informal fellowship, women who live outside the tidy categories that keep the village in order. You don't meet formally, you don't chant, but you know each other. One day, an older woman named Sibylla stops you after Mass. She's known for her apples and her absence from public gossip. She says, "You're brave. I did the same once. Long ago, only I didn't go to court. I just walked into the woods and came out with no husband." She grins. You grin back. You don't ask questions. Later that week, she gives you a pie. No explanation. Just a pie. This is what solidarity looks like. And in that quiet space where marriage no longer defines you, you start remembering who you were before. You start reading again. Prayers. Sure. But also ballads and saints' lives and one scrap of verse hidden in the seam of an old tunic. You start tending your own garden, pruning vines that had been neglected for years. You speak more slowly, more deliberately, not because you're afraid, but because no one gets to interrupt you anymore. One afternoon, the neighbor girl comes by, the one whose case you witnessed in court. She's pale, eyes wide, voice shaking. She says she can't go back home. She says the court denied her. You invite her in. You make tea, not strong, but warm. You let her sit in silence, and when she asks what happens next, you don't tell her to pray harder or be patient. You tell her what you did and what you might do next, because now you're thinking about options. You've heard rumors of communities in the hills where abandoned women live together, tending sheep and boiling their own soap. You've heard of widows who become midwives and scribes and even, not so rarely, moneylenders. You've heard of sisters who fake madness, join pilgrimages, or disappear into the sea with nothing but a coin and a cloak. You're not sure what path you'll take, but you know one thing: you're not going back. You sleep now without fear of the door creaking open in the dark, without holding your breath at the sound of boots on stone, without waking up to bruises and blame. The separation decree is folded beneath your mattress, already creased at the edges. You keep it there, not because you need reminding, but because it proves the world bent, just slightly, for you. And in that soft, quiet, in-between life, you begin to breathe like someone who owns her lungs again. You never thought you'd envy a nun, not the prayers at dawn, or the woolen robes, or the endless cycle of fasting and feasting, praying and sweeping, sweeping and praying. But now, after everything, you find yourself wondering what it would feel like to be behind those stone walls, safe, hidden, left alone. Because for some women in your position, those with no family support, no legal victory, no sympathetic priest, the convent wasn't a calling, it was a lifeboat. You pass one on your walk to market. High walls, iron-banded gates, the scent of lavender and old wood drifting through a slit in the wall. Once, you thought of it as a place for the holy. Now you know it was also a last refuge for the desperate. Nuns in the Middle Ages were supposed to be brides of Christ, committed to poverty, chastity, and obedience. But step inside, and the picture blurs, behind the chanting and incense. Convents were also networks of female autonomy. They were among the very few places where women could read, write, own property, and make decisions without male oversight. And for a woman like you, walking away from a cruel marriage with no legal annulment or means to live alone, taking the veil was sometimes the only exit not guarded by shame. It wasn't always noble. Sometimes, families paid to send unwanted daughters there. Sometimes, battered wives begged entry at the gates, seeking sanctuary. And occasionally, the church used convents like holding pens. Easier than excommunicating a troublesome woman, they simply enclosed her. Historians still argue whether this was liberation or incarceration. A convent offered safety. Yes, but it also erased you. Your name was changed. Your dress, your hair, your voice, softened, subdued, subsumed into the daily rhythms of the rule. For some, it was peace. For others, it was a very quiet prison. Still, many women chose it. You recall the story of Hildegard of Bingen, visionary, composer, healer, nun. She entered the convent young, but rose to power, corresponding with popes and emperors. Her writings defied the expectation that women were spiritually inferior. She didn't just pray, she published. Then there's Clare of Assisi, who fled marriage altogether. Cutting her hair and joining Francis under cover of darkness, she established a new order, spoke against patriarchs, slept on straw and led with iron resolve. Of course, you're no Hildegard, no Clare, but you understand now, for medieval women, cloisters weren't just cages, they were choices, strategic ones. You hear tales of women who manipulated their way in. One married woman, Margaret from Saxony, faked a vision, claimed the Virgin Mary had spoken to her in a dream, commanding her to devote her life to silence and prayer. Her husband objected. The bishop investigated. She was found genuinely touched by divine spirit and allowed to join the sisters. Years later, she was abbess. Another simply ran, changed her clothes, walked 60 miles north, took a different name and claimed widowhood. By the time anyone traced her, she'd already taken final vows. Of course, not everyone was so lucky. Some convents refused women fleeing marriage, afraid of scandal, afraid of church retribution, afraid of the husbands who came banging at the gates with swords and bishops' letters. And for the woman who left without entering anywhere, the wandering wife, life was even harder. No legal protection, no roof, no husband, but no respectability either. In the eyes of society, a woman outside marriage and outside religious life was unanchored, suspect, possibly a witch, possibly a whore. You start to understand why the veil was so tempting. In many parts of Europe, the veil made you untouchable. You couldn't be summoned to court. You couldn't be remarried against your will. You couldn't be corrected by a priest or a husband. You became God's. And sometimes that was better than being anyone else's. You wonder what it would be like. The long corridors, the cool stone floors, the quiet chanting rising at dawn. You, in a cell of your own, reading psalms, writing letters, growing herbs in the garden without fear that a boot will kick them over. You picture yourself lighting a candle with steady hands. Not for penance, for peace. Would you be lonely? Maybe. But not in the same way you were before. Not the kind of loneliness that curled around your bones in your marital bed. Not the kind that made you afraid of your own shadow. This would be solitude of your choosing, a softer silence. But for now, you remain outside the walls, watching, wondering. Because while the convent might be a refuge, it also means giving up everything. Your name, your autonomy, your tiny sliver of possibility. And though you're tired, though your hands are raw from work, and your feet ache from standing too long at the bakery stall, part of you still wants more. You haven't given up on life just yet. But if it comes to it, if the threats return, if the law turns its back, if the village gossip grows teeth, you know where the door is. And maybe, just maybe, the Virgin will speak to you in a dream too. You never meant to get caught up in politics, but then again, you never meant to get married either. Not to him, not that young, and certainly not as part of a deal involving sheep, wine barrels, and your father's third cousin's claim to a crumbling stone tower. You're not a noblewoman. But tonight, let's pretend you are, just for a moment. Because noblewomen didn't get married for love. They got married for strategy. Your wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a treaty. And if you thought leaving a marriage was hard for a peasant woman, try doing it when your father is a duke and your husband is best friends with the king. You've heard the whispers in court. She asked for an annulment. Eyes widen. Fans flutter. Her poor husband is beside himself. Of course, he's not. He's playing chess and drinking Bordeaux while his honor is debated in Latin by men in velvet hats. Welcome to the elite divorce club, where power, politics, and prestige shape everything, including your freedom. Among the nobility, walking away from marriage wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. If you were a countess, your dowry might include land, fortresses, even military rights. If you tried to leave, your husband could claim you were rebelling. Against him. Against order. Against God. You wouldn't just lose your status. You could spark a war. But that didn't stop some of them. Take Berengaria of Navarre. She married Richard the Lionheart. Yes, that Richard. And spent most of their marriage not with him. Some even argue it was never consummated. After his death, she fought bitterly to receive her widow's pension, writing letters to multiple popes. She didn't win easily, but she persisted. Or Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of both France and England. She managed to annul her marriage to Louis VII, citing consanguinity, which, again, everyone knew from the start. The real issue? She couldn't produce a male heir, so she left and promptly married Henry Plantagenet. Historians still argue whether she left him or he left her, but one thing's clear, she made the second marriage on her own terms, and in between queens there were duchesses, countesses, and baronesses, strategists in silk and sapphires, who walked a tightrope over dynastic collapse just to escape. You learn that even power doesn't buy you an easy exit, it just buys you different tools. Wealthy noblewomen often petitioned Rome directly, not just to bishops or local courts, but to the Pope. They wrote letters detailing their suffering or their schemes, framed with religious devotion and just enough flattery to nudge the papal conscience. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. One countess in northern Italy petitioned for annulment based on magical impotence. She claimed her husband had been cursed by a former lover and could no longer perform. The church investigated. The lover was questioned. The husband was made to undergo public examinations that, we'll skip the details. The result? Petition denied. The church ruled that if he was ever capable, the marriage stood. You suppress a shiver. Powerful women had other options too, ones not available to you. They could flee to family estates. They could hire mercenaries. They could lock themselves in towers and issue writs from windows. And if their husbands crossed a certain line, they might even arrange an accident. There are stories. Unverified. Of course. A poisoned fig. A loose stair tile. A falcon that panicked during a hunt. History doesn't always name these women. but it leaves clues. You don't admire the violence, but you understand the desperation. Because when your body is a political pawn, sometimes all you want is control over your fate, over your future, over one moment of decision. And let's not forget the children. Among the noble class, children were currency. Custody battles weren't about affection, they were about claims. If you walked away from your husband, you might never see your sons again. Your daughters might be betrothed without your knowledge. Your household, your legacy, could be stripped from you like a wine-stained cloak. And yet, some women still chose to leave. They risked everything, not because they didn't love their children, but because they believed that staying would be worse. Some negotiated clever deals. One duchess agreed to retreat to a convent in exchange for the right to raise her youngest daughter there. Another, in Castile, leveraged an annulment to become guardian of her late husband's bastard children, turning scandal into influence. You realize something, standing in your village with a borrowed cloak and the dust of old roses in your hands. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, a castle or a cottage. The story was the same. When women walked away from marriage in the Middle Ages, they weren't just leaving a man, they were leaving everything that made them legible to the world, and in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to exist. You don't have a title. You don't have lands or letters from Rome, but you have the same bone-deep desire to belong to yourself. And that, it turns out, is a royal ambition in any era. They said she was lucky to get the children, but luck had nothing to do with it. She memorized legal phrases, bribed a village priest, and cried on command in front of a bishop. She kept the bruises visible, but her voice soft. She kissed her son's forehead with dry lips and told the court, "He needs someone who won't forget he exists when there's wine in the room." And somehow, they agreed. Tonight, you think about her, because tonight's story is about one of the rarest, fiercest outcomes in medieval divorce, when the woman walks away and takes the children and the land with her. Custody in medieval Europe wasn't about maternal instinct. It was about inheritance, continuity, control. Fathers had the legal edge almost always. After all, children, especially sons, weren't seen as little people with personalities and fears and favorite foods. They were assets, future laborers, future heirs. Custody was a battle over dynasty, not bedtime stories. And yet, cracks appeared. In certain regions, especially Italy and parts of France, courts began to consider the mother's role in a child's moral upbringing. If the father was proven violent, heretical, or habitually absent, she might be awarded custody, not because of her love, but because of his failure. Historians still debate whether these cases reflected a shift in gender norms, or simply a strategic effort by church courts to enforce morality. Either way, the result was the same. For some women, separation didn't just mean safety. It meant possession. You hear of a woman in Toulouse who fled her husband and hid in a convent for 3 months. When she emerged, she petitioned for a decree of separation and custody of her daughter. Her case was rejected, so she returned, took her child in the night, and disappeared into the Pyrenees. 20 years later, her daughter returned to claim a portion of the father's vineyard, and won. You think, that's not justice. That's survival playing the long game. Then there's Lady Isabella of Brienne, whose marriage collapsed into political rubble. She retained not only custody of her daughters, but control over their dowries. She arranged marriages that served her own family's interests, not her estranged husband's. She wasn't acting as a mother, Rousseau, she was acting as a matriarch. Closer to your world, you hear simpler stories. A woman whose husband was taken by war. Everyone assumed she'd remarry. Instead, she declared herself wife in spirit only, and kept the family's goats and both children. Years later, the husband returned. She locked the door. Or another woman who arranged to trade custody. The son went with the father, the daughter with her. No official papers. Just a verbal deal sealed over bad wine and exhausted sighs. The kind of quiet negotiation that history rarely records. But that changes lives all the same. It wasn't always about children. Sometimes it was land. Under certain customs, especially in regions influenced by Roman law, a woman could inherit and even manage property. If her dowry had been significant, or if she had mourning gifts, land given by the husband after consummation, she might retain possession even after separation, but only if she could fight for it. You imagine her, standing in court with calloused hands, explaining that the north field was hers before she ever touched a spindle in his house, that her goats had her brand, that the olive trees were from her father's grove. She isn't pleading, she's reminding, and sometimes they listened, not often, not enough. But the record shows moments when a woman left marriage and did not leave empty-handed, when she took her children, or her sheep, or the ledger book, or the linen chest, and walked not into obscurity, but into her own life. The villagers might grumble. They might whisper, "She took more than she gave." But the truth, she took what was hers. You look around your own small dwelling now, a room barely bigger than a stable, 2 stools, a small fire, a heavy trunk you dragged here yourself, and inside that trunk, a ledger, 3 dresses, a folded legal decree, and a pair of children's shoes you haven't thrown out yet, even though their owner now sleeps with their grandmother 2 villages away, because not everyone gets to keep the children. That's the part they leave out in the fairy tales. You tried, you wept, you argued, you had witnesses, but the court said your husband had reformed, that the children would need a male presence to ensure their proper instruction, that it was better for their souls, and so you visit on feast days. You bring baked apples and stories. You kiss their hair and promise just a little longer, because you're not done yet. You're reading again about Roman law, about canon codes, about ways in. You're saving coin. You're learning how to say custody in Latin and how to write your name clearly so that even the scribes can't erase it. Because next time, you won't just walk away, you'll return with a case, with proof, with fire, and when they ask why you're here, you'll say, "Because they are mine, because this land was mine, because I left, but I never surrendered." And this time, you'll leave with more than scars. They parade her through the square like a criminal, not because she stole or fought or poisoned a man with herbs and a smirk. No, her crime was worse. In their eyes, she left. You stand at the edge of the crowd, clutching your shawl tight. She wears no veil now. Her hair is unbound, a small but deliberate insult to the order that tried to contain her. Around her neck hangs a sign, "Disobedient Wife." She walks barefoot, mud between her toes, bruises high on her cheek, but her back is straight. This is not justice. This is a message. Because when the church couldn't punish a woman legally, society did it socially, and often publicly. Welcome to the long, humiliating tradition of ritual shame, the pillory, the stocks, the public confession, the scolding parade. For some women, the price of walking away from marriage wasn't a court ruling or a fine, it was reputation, spit, and laughter. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in England and the Low Countries, local courts known as manorial courts or borough courts would hold public punishments for misconduct. That included wives accused of abandonment, disobedience, or lewd behavior, which often meant leaving their husband without official approval. The punishments varied. Some were placed in the pillory, a wooden frame that locked their head and hands. Passers-by could jeer, throw rotten food, or worse. Others were forced to wear symbolic costumes, a bridle, a dunce cap, even mock wedding garb splattered with ash. A few were toncarted, strapped to a cart and pulled through town to the sound of banging pots, like a parade turned inside out. You may have heard of the scold's bridle, a metal cage for the mouth, fitted with a small plate to press down the tongue. It was used on women who talked too much or argued in public. But its deeper purpose was clear: to silence. Historians still argue whether these punishments were truly widespread or exaggerated in popular lore, but enough records survive to prove their use and to show how public shame became a tool of marital enforcement. And the cruelest part? These rituals weren't always imposed by men. Sometimes it was women, neighbors, cousins, even mothers-in-law who led the charge. Society teaches us early that a disobedient woman threatens all women, because if she can leave, maybe we can too. And that idea must be crushed. But some women turned the humiliation back on its source. There's the case of a brewer's wife in York who, after being pilloried for insulting her husband's virility, returned the next market day, dressed as a monk, and handed out prayers to passers-by, asking them to bless her husband's shortcomings. She was fined again, yes, but she became a folk legend. Or a woman in Ghent who, forced to wear a sign reading "lecherous wife," added her own note underneath: "At least I chose who." Quirky, maybe. Brave, absolutely. But humor was dangerous too, because mocking the system made it fragile, and fragile systems get angry. You've seen it firsthand. The neighbor girl, who finally left her drunkard husband, only to be summoned to confess without malice in front of the congregation. She stood there, fists clenched, lips thin, reciting lines she barely believed. "I am sorry for disturbing the peace of my home." It wasn't repentance. It was theater, and everyone knew it. Still, she did it, because refusing meant excommunication. And while excommunication sounds spiritual, it was deeply practical. You couldn't trade, couldn't receive charity, couldn't be buried in sacred ground. To walk away from marriage without permission was to risk social death. But for some women, the choice was clear. They walked anyway. And you've started collecting stories. You write them on scraps, charcoal scribbles on old linen, notes tucked between herb pages. You keep a tally: who left, how, what happened. It's not public, not yet, but it will be, one day, when enough women whisper the same names. The stories won't belong to shame anymore. They'll belong to memory, and maybe, just maybe, to honor, because sometimes surviving the punishment becomes the victory. Sometimes walking through the market in bare feet becomes a march. Sometimes the girl in the stocks is the bravest woman you know. And sometimes, when the crowd throws spoiled onions, A single hand passes her a clean ribbon. You see it happen, and you swear you'll carry one too, just in case. She's laughing. At first you think it's nerves, or madness, or both. But no, she's genuinely laughing, sitting under a tree on the edge of the village, her feet bare, her dress rumpled, and her entire life in a small bundle at her side. You ask her what happened. She says she escaped by pretending to be a ghost. You blink. She grins. He thought I died in the river. I left my headscarf on the bank, walked 20 miles by moonlight, and when he came to the priest crying, I watched the whole thing from behind a tree. She takes a bite of stolen bread and chuckles again. I've never felt more alive. Tonight, your story is not about court rulings or canon law. It's about women who fake their way to freedom through madness, disguise, lies, luck, and whatever scraps of power they could find. Because when systems fail and doors don't open, some women build their own exits. You've heard these tales whispered since childhood, half believed, half feared. The miller's wife who feigned possession to avoid her husband's bed, the scullery girl who dressed as a boy and joined a trading ship, the nun who escaped the convent with nothing but a donkey and a forged death record. Some stories are probably folklore. Others? Too detailed to dismiss. You hear about a woman in 14th century France who convinced a priest that her husband's touch gave her seizures. Divine rejection, she called it. He believed her. So did the local bishop. They granted her separation for the health of her soul. Later, it came out she had been coached by a former midwife with a flair for theater. You almost admire it. Historians still argue whether these performances were outliers or indicators of broader female strategy. Was this rebellion or desperation? Were these women cunning or merely cornered? You know the answer. It was both. Sometimes you play mad because it's the only way anyone takes your suffering seriously. In one Flemish case, a woman smeared ash on her face, tore her gown, and began wandering the marketplace muttering biblical phrases. Her husband claimed she'd gone mad. The court agreed, but declared her unfit for conjugal duties. She was placed in the custody of her sister and never returned to him. Of course, faking madness was dangerous. If the court decided you were truly mad, you could be locked in a cell, exiled to a monastery, or worse, stripped of all property. So others took a different path. Disguise. The records are rare, but powerful. A woman in southern Germany escaped her violent husband by shaving her head and joining a band of traveling minstrels, disguised as a boy. She sang ballads in falsetto and juggled knives. When her husband eventually tracked her down, he didn't recognize her, and by then, she'd made enough coin to vanish for good. Or the baker's wife in London who dressed as a widow, complete with black veil, forged mourning ring, and a false death notice in the parish register. She rented a room in another town, opened a pie stall, and married a kindly carpenter who never asked about her past. No one ever told her first husband. Then there were women who leaned into spiritual visions. In Bohemia, one wife declared she had been visited by Saint Margaret, who told her to leave her husband and build a shrine near the river. She made a hut, burned sage, and collected donations. Pilgrims came. The bishop eventually shut it down, but not before she'd lived 3 peaceful years alone. It sounds like madness. But sometimes, madness is freedom dressed in strange clothes. And you? You start to wonder what role you would play if it came to that. Would you fake fits, Stumble into court with torn sleeves and a faraway look? Would you bury a doll in the backyard and claim it was your soul? Would you dress as a boy and take a barge downriver? Call yourself Simon or Tom? Chop your hair? Learn to drink without flinching? Or would you fake a pilgrimage? Walk to Canterbury or Cologne, carrying prayers and intentions, but no plans of returning? One woman you know, quiet, sweet-faced, a seamstress with wrists like twigs, tells you she once faked being mute for 6 full weeks to avoid answering to her abusive husband. It gave me time, she said. He grew tired. He left. You want to laugh, or cry, or both, because this isn't how it should be, but it's how it is. You begin to collect these stories in your memory, in scribbled notes, in dreams. They become a tapestry of resistance. Each thread dyed in fear, wit, and raw human need. And someday, when another woman comes to you with shaking hands and a question in her eyes, you'll give her the tools, a name, a map, a lie that might work, because maybe her only way out is through a story, and maybe, just maybe, it ends with her under a tree, laughing. You're in the sacristy, knees pressed against the cold stone floor, pretending to pray, but you're not praying, you're listening. The bishop is speaking with a canon lawyer near the altar curtain, their Latin drifting just loud enough to catch. Words like defeci, a defect of consent. Spiritual impediment. Non-performance. Not sins, necessarily, just technicalities. Your ears perk up, because what they're discussing, quietly, cautiously, is something women like you rarely hear spoken aloud. Loopholes. No one announces them. No scribe lists them clearly, but they exist, woven into the corners of canon law like unpicked embroidery threads. And sometimes, if you pull the right one, the whole thing unravels. Tonight, you learn that even in the tight, sanctified grip of medieval marriage doctrine, there were ways out, dusty, obscure, often contradictory, but real. Let's talk about the loopholes the church tried not to advertise. One of the most potent, pre-contract. If either party had made a binding promise to marry someone else before their current union, the marriage could be deemed invalid, even if consummated. And binding didn't always mean written. It could be as flimsy as 2 teenagers exchanging vows beside a well, witnessed only by a bored cow and a slightly tipsy cousin. If you could prove it, via witness or record or sheer persuasive storytelling, your current marriage might be voided. Of course, that's easier when the forgotten fiancé is willing to show up. Then there's consanguinity, marriage within forbidden degrees of kinship. In modern terms, we're too closely related. The church had rules, no closer than the 7th degree, then later the 4th. Calculating those ties was a mess of family trees and godly guesswork. If you could prove your husband was your 3rd cousin once removed on your aunt's illegitimate side, bam, possible annulment. Not because the church wanted you to leave, but because they didn't want bad genetics or incest rumors fouling up holy unions. Another path? Lack of true consent. If you were coerced, forced, tricked, if you were 12 years old and didn't understand what was happening, your marriage might not be valid in the eyes of God, especially if you'd said no at any point before the vows. Of course, proving coercion is like proving a dream, but it has been done. Historians still argue whether these clauses were meant to protect women or to shield the church from scandal. Were they tools of compassion or just legal lint traps, gathering dust until someone bold enough swept them up? And don't forget spiritual impediment. If one partner had taken prior vows, like chastity or minor holy orders, the marriage could be annulled. There's a recorded case of a man who had once promised to join a monastery, then changed his mind and married. When his wife sought separation, she invoked his broken vow. The court ruled in her favor. You imagine his face when he realized his teenage flirtation with monkhood had cost him his rights. Then there's a strange, seldom used one: impotence. It had to be perpetual and pre-existing. The couple had to undergo tests. You don't want to imagine how, but if proven, the church might grant annulment. The logic? Marriage exists partly for procreation. No procreation, no valid sacrament. Of course, no one liked these cases. The courts handled them like hot coals, briefly, reluctantly, and with as few witnesses as possible. You begin to see the threads forming in your mind. You don't need a sword. You need a technicality, a flaw in the fabric. You start asking careful questions. Was it true your husband had a betrothal before you? Your cousin married a man who turned out to be a priest, right? Wasn't your mother's family from the same parish as his? And slowly, the invisible map emerges. Even the most rigid systems have corners. And in those corners, clever women wait. You remember Sister Agnes, the abbess with a sly smile, who once said, "The Lord speaks plainly, but canon lawyers whisper." She helped 3 women navigate their way through the labyrinth, one through consanguinity, one through pre-contract, and one by proving her husband was secretly married in another town. That last one? She found a second wedding ring in his satchel. Proof, tucked next to a wheel of moldy cheese. You laugh softly at the memory. Because survival, in your world, often comes disguised as coincidence, or cunning, or cheese. So now, you look at your own life with new eyes. Was there a childhood promise made to that boy near the river? Witnessed by your grandmother? Might that count? Did your husband once joke, drunk and staggering, that he had no seed left to sow? Could that be tested? Wasn't there a third cousin who claimed to be descended from the same night as your great-uncle? You start writing, compiling, cross-referencing, whispering with scribes and scribbling in the margins of borrowed psalters. You don't call it a case, you call it a letter to heaven, but it's one destined for Rome. Because sometimes the key to walking away isn't defiance or drama, it's a footnote. And you're learning to write your own. He dies in his sleep. No last words. No priest. Just a snore that never finishes. You don't cry. You sit beside the body for a while, long enough for the silence to feel solid, like furniture. Then you walk outside and breathe so deeply it hurts. Not from grief. From the sudden absence of him. The man who broke your ribs. Who boiled your voice down to a whisper, who called you mine like it was a curse. You don't light a candle, but you do boil water, for tea, for laundry, for everything you couldn't do freely when he was alive. Because now you're a widow, and suddenly, for the first time in your life, you're free. Medieval widowhood, believe it or not, was often the most powerful phase in a woman's life. Marriage tied you to a man. Maidenhood tied you to your father. But widowhood? Widowhood could be a ladder, or a weapon, or an escape hatch with lace trim. And for women who couldn't get out while the husband lived, this was the cleanest, quietest way. You see it in how people treat you. They bow now. They call you madam, not wife of. The priest offers prayers. The baker offers credit. You receive condolences with the same neutral nod every time. It's not joy you feel, but possibility. Your property is yours again. The goats, and the tools, and the back corner of the garden he always said was too wild. Now, it's your herb patch. You clean out his room, find 5 knives, one old letter addressed to another woman, and a pouch of coins you never knew about. You keep the knives, burn the letter, spend the coins on shoes for the boy next door whose mother can't afford them. You start walking straighter, because here's the secret no one says aloud in church. For many women in the Middle Ages, widowhood was the first time they truly belonged to themselves. Not that it was easy. Far from it. Widows were still vulnerable, economically, socially, sexually. A woman alone with property could be seen as available. Some were forced to remarry by their families, pressured into unions to secure alliances or produce more heirs. Others were labeled dangerous, especially if they spoke too freely, or managed estates too well, or wore red instead of black. Historians still argue whether widows were empowered figures or perpetual targets. It depends on the record and who wrote it. Monks saw them as cautionary tales. Merchants saw them as clients. Poets saw them as tragic or temptresses. You see them as survivors. You meet one, Lady Johanna, 2 villages over. Her husband died mysteriously after a feast. The soup, they say. No charges were ever brought. Now she manages 3 fields, owns 2 oxen, and teaches local girls how to read enough Latin to run a ledger. Another, Maud, never married again. She kept bees, sold honey, hosted travelers, and every spring planted a row of tulips that spelled out her name if you viewed them from the hill. Even the church began to recognize widows' influence. Some founded convents, some endowed hospitals, some became benefactors of manuscript production. They had money and no husband to sign the checks. They could commission art, dictate wills, and sponsor sermons. And they knew things. One elderly widow was consulted by the bishop himself for local dispute arbitration. Why? Because she remembered everyone's business from the last 40 years. Her memory was sharper than any sword. Of course, not all widows wanted power. Some just wanted peace. To sleep in a quiet house. To wake when they chose. To wear their hair however they liked. To remember who they were before they had to answer to anyone. You start thinking about how many women waited, not for rescue, but for death to do what courts and cleverness could not. Some helped it along. You hear a story whispered behind a tavern. A woman who fed her husband mashed nettles for a month. He wasted away. No bruises. No blood. Just a mystery illness. She cried at the funeral. The priest praised her devotion. You don't judge her, because sometimes, when the door won't open, you take a chisel to the wall. You didn't kill your husband, but you're not sorry he's gone. You're sorry it took this long. Now, you move through life differently. You walk where you want, speak when you wish. You sit in the town hall during disputes. No one interrupts you. No one dares. You keep a ledger of your fields. You hire a boy to help with the goats. You even start writing again, at night, by candlelight, little fragments of memory and hope. Sometimes you still flinch when a door slams, or when someone shouts, but the bruises are gone, and the silence no longer feels like punishment. It feels like a beginning. And when another woman comes to you, eyes wide, voice shaking, asking, "How did you do it?" You don't lie. You say, "I waited. I planned. I survived." And then you hand her a jar of honey, because freedom, like sweetness, is best when shared. The dust clings to your sandals as you cross the narrow street in Naples. Or is it Barcelona? Maybe Constantinople? You've been traveling for days now, through bustling markets and behind cloister walls, listening not for merchants or monks, but for women's stories. Because tonight, we shift our gaze south, away from the damp cloisters of England or the smoky hearths of the Rhine, and toward the sun-blistered alleys and tiled courtyards of the Mediterranean world, where the rules of marriage were sometimes more fluid and sometimes more brutal. Here, under the combined weight of Roman law, canon law, and local custom, women found both oppression and opportunity. Take Italy. In places like Bologna and Florence, urban women had access to legal literacy far earlier than in the north. Why? Because cities needed records, contracts, dowries, marriage settlements. And so women, especially those from merchant families, learned to read, not poetry, but ledgers, not psalms, but clauses. That meant they could spot a loophole. Some southern courts were more willing to consider legal separations, especially when finances were at stake. If a husband squandered his wife's dowry, or brought shame upon her family, she could petition for protection of her assets and residence away from his household. One Florentine woman, Allegra de Neri, famously petitioned for separation after her husband lost their dowry in a dice game. The court ruled in her favor. She took back her vineyard and moved in with her sister. Her husband later tried to reclaim it and was chased off the land by farmhands loyal to Allegra. You love her. Further south, in Byzantium, women fared differently. Greek Orthodox law had its own quirks. Divorce was possible, not easily, but officially. Mutual consent was sometimes accepted. If a woman could prove neglect, impotence, or abandonment, she might be granted release. One widow, whose husband had left for Egypt and never returned, was granted a legal dissolution after 7 years. She remarried, without scandal. 7 years. You think about that number, long enough to plant a tree, raise a child, rebuild a life. In Spain, the story changes again. Here, the layers of Visigothic, Moorish, and Christian law created a fascinating legal mosaic. Under Visigothic law, women could own property, represent themselves in court, and even file for divorce. Yes, divorce. Not just separation. When the Christian kingdoms later reasserted control, some of these customs persisted, especially in Castile. You hear of Elvira, a Castilian noblewoman who divorced her husband for failing to consummate the marriage and went on to found a hospital. She wasn't punished. She was admired. In Andalusia, under Muslim rule, the khul system allowed women to initiate divorce, though often requiring the return of a dowry or financial compensation. Still, it was formal, legal, documented. Muslim women in cities like Cordoba and Granada sometimes filed for divorce on grounds of neglect or poor treatment, and their cases were heard. Historians still argue whether this reflects greater legal freedom or just different forms of control. But the documentation is real. The court records exist, and the names of the women, though often written in flowing Arabic script or scribbled Latin, remain. Back in Naples, you sit at a fountain with 2 older women peeling oranges. They talk of a girl who ran off with a sailor. Her husband petitioned for her return. The bishop denied it. She's already crossed water, he said. She belongs to the sea now. You imagine her, hair tangled by salt, eyes stung by wind, finally herself. These southern regions had one other advantage: pilgrimage routes. If you were desperate, if you were clever, if you had just enough coin and a stolen cloak, you could vanish into the tide of pilgrims heading to Rome, Santiago, or Jerusalem. No one questioned a woman with a scallop shell and a rosary, and if you made it far enough, long enough, sometimes you didn't have to come back. One woman from Aragon made it all the way to a convent in Cyprus, where she lived out her days as Sister Beata, never seen again by the husband who'd branded her shoulder. You start thinking of maps differently now, not just lines and borders, but routes of escape, pathways of possibility. You mark rivers, abbeys, ports, places where stories say women slipped through, because south of the Alps, it seems, women played the same game, but with slightly more cards. You begin to collect phrases from each region: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Castilian, the words for leave, for free, for mine, and you whisper them under your breath like prayers. Because even if you stay in your own village forever, you now carry the knowledge that somewhere a woman left and lived. And sometimes that's all the courage you need. The feast is over, but no one is smiling. The roast peacock is cold. The musicians are packing up. The wine has turned bitter in your mouth. You glance across the hall at your husband, no longer a boy, not yet a king, his crown askew, his attention elsewhere. You clutch your goblet a little tighter. You're a queen now, and you're miserable, because no title, no coronation, no jeweled girdle can protect you from the quiet truth settling into your bones. Even royal marriages break. And tonight, we talk about power couples who didn't last. Some women left quietly. Some were cast aside. Others fought, legally, politically, spiritually, for the right to separate from the most powerful men in Europe. Because royalty didn't mean happiness, it meant dynasty. And dynasties, like any house built too tall, eventually crack. Let's start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, the crown jewel of noble defiance, Duchess in her own right, Queen of France by marriage, Queen of England by better marriage. Her first union to Louis VII was stiff, cold, and marked by endless sermons and no sons. She petitioned the church for annulment, citing consanguinity. They were distant cousins, which everyone already knew. But behind the Latin phrasing, everyone understood the truth. Eleanor wanted out. She got it. And less than 2 months later, married Henry Plantagenet, 10 years younger, burning with ambition, and soon to be King of England. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's annulment was her idea or Louis's, but what's certain is this: she negotiated her exit. She kept her lands, she kept her dignity, she became queen again on her own terms. Then there's Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry the Faithful, married off to James IV of Scotland. After his death at Flodden, she acted as regent for their son, James V. When she remarried, without England's permission, she lost that regency. But later, when her second marriage soured, she sought a divorce and got it under Scottish law. She was a queen, a mother, and a political actor, and she refused to stay tied to a man who dragged her down. But not every royal wife was allowed such control. Isabella of Angoulême, married to King John of England, was little more than a bargaining chip in his ceaseless power games. After his death, she returned to France and took a lover. The church did not approve. She was forced into a convent, her titles stripped. She died in obscurity. Her sin? Living without a husband? And then, of course, there's Anne of Bohemia, who married King Richard II of England. Their union was, by most accounts, peaceful, even affectionate. But Anne died young. Richard never remarried. And in that silence, you sense the tragedy not of separation, but of never having had the power to choose in the first place. You realize that royal marriages weren't immune to anything, not boredom, not betrayal, not bruises. They just came with better clothes and more Latin. Even queens could be traded, humiliated, or discarded, like Empress Theophanu, a Byzantine princess sent to marry Otto II of the Holy Roman Empire. She brought perfumes, silk, complex cutlery, and a backbone. After his death, she ruled as regent for their son, Otto III, fending off bishops and scheming nobles. She never remarried. She didn't have to. Power, once tasted, doesn't leave the tongue easily. You sit back and imagine these women, not as portraits, not as tapestries, but as people. Tired, clever, trapped, hopeful, strategic. Some stayed, some walked away, some disappeared into history wearing veils of silence, but others made noise. You think of Berengaria of Navarre, who outlived Richard the Lionheart by decades, fighting for her widow's pension well into old age, or Blanche of Castile, who ruled as regent in France and refused every suitor offered to her after her husband's death. They weren't just survivors. They were chroniclers of their own fates. Each decision a line in the ledger of power, each refusal to submit a footnote in the gospel of agency, and suddenly, your own life, your own escape, feels less like an exception and more like a tradition of women who refuse to be footnotes. Of course, you're not royal. Your bed doesn't have embroidered pillows. Your bath doesn't smell of rosewater. You don't have bishops petitioning on your behalf. But you share something with those queens, a spine, and maybe that's enough. So when the neighbor girl asks why you walk so straight these days, you tell her about Eleanor, about Margaret, about queens who refuse to be kept. You say, a crown doesn't free you, but knowing your worth can, and then you keep walking. Because history's power couples may not have lasted, but their wives did. And some of them became legends. They say she's dangerous now. She lives in the edge house with the green shutters, the one just past the mill where the air always smells faintly of thyme and something sharper. Children dare each other to knock on her door and run. Men lower their voices when passing her in the street. Women glance twice, once to judge, once to wonder, because she's divorced, not legally, perhaps, not officially, but everyone knows she left, and she didn't come back. And that's terrifying, because a woman who walks away from her husband and doesn't vanish in shame or starvation, who thrives, forces everyone to question the rules. You're beginning to see her kind more clearly now, not just survivors, but threats. And in tonight's tale, we meet the divorced and dangerous, the women who didn't just leave, they became someone else after. You know one of them. Everyone does. She used to cry behind the butcher's stall. Now she runs her own cheese stand. Same spot, same apron, different voice. She doesn't ask permission to speak anymore, or lower her eyes when the reeve walks by. She makes men uncomfortable now, not because she's vulgar, or loud, or angry, but because she's independent. And independence? That's contagious. In medieval Europe, the idea of a woman alone, unattached, unmarried, unowned, was unsettling. Such a woman was often accused of sorcery, stubbornness, or sin. She didn't fit the categories. She was unpredictable. Historians still argue whether this was rooted in genuine fear or convenient control. Was independence truly dangerous, or just painted that way to keep other women in line? You suspect the answer is both. You begin to collect their stories. There's the widow in Bruges, who turned her husband's brewery into a community tavern where no man was allowed to shout. She didn't remarry. She hired girls from the poor quarter and taught them sums between shifts. The bishop tried to shut her down. She paid his cousin's debt instead. The tavern stayed open. There's the midwife in Avignon who walked out of her marriage after the third miscarriage. She set up shop in the old apothecary house and started mixing tinctures for women who couldn't afford convents or doctors. When they tried to accuse her of witchcraft, half the town came to her defense. And in Norwich, a woman named Agnes turned her legal separation into a small empire. She ran 3 properties, leased a fish stall, and adopted an orphaned niece. Her name appears in tax records, court petitions, and even one bishop's letter complaining that she was overfond of disputing matters with men. A backhanded compliment. Really. These women didn't just walk away. They walked into something else, something larger. You hear about a woman in Milan who opened a lace school for girls, another in Seville who joined a traveling theater troupe and rewrote half their script to make the heroine live at the end. They became visible. And visibility, for a woman alone, is power, but also danger, because not everyone celebrates your survival. You notice the change in your own life, the way people react when you speak without deferring, when you show up at market with your sleeves rolled and your hair uncovered, when you fix your own roof, haggle without blinking, and laugh at jokes without pretending you don't understand them. There are whispers. She must be cursed. She reads too much. She probably poisoned him. But also, fewer invitations to weddings, more visits from young girls with bruised hearts and quiet questions, a new sort of glance from the merchant's wife, one that says, "Teach me how." You're not trying to lead a revolution, but you are living a life that wasn't supposed to happen. A woman who left, who lived, who didn't become a cautionary tale. It's not perfect. You still flinch at loud voices, still worry someone will come knocking with a writ or a priest or worse. But every day that passes, you grow bolder. You start writing down your knowledge, how to draft a petition, how to navigate a consistory court, how to disguise bruises with elderberry, how to say "I am not yours" in Latin, French, and Flemish. You lend a book to the blacksmith's daughter. Show a washerwoman how to sign her name. Refuse to lower your price for a merchant just because he grins. You don't call it rebellion, but you know it is. And when another woman walks into the tavern, hair tangled, eyes darting, holding a child with one hand and her fear with the other, you pour her soup without asking, offer her the corner room, and say, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Because divorced and dangerous doesn't mean wicked. It means free, and maybe a little frightening. You hear it first in a song, a low, lilting tune hummed by a spinning maid, barely audible over the whir of the wheel. The lyrics are simple, about a woman who weeps by a river, who hides her name in her sleeve, who walks into the woods and never returns. You don't ask questions. You just hum along, because you've started to realize the stories of women who left their marriages live in whispers, not scrolls, not in court records, not in sermons, not in saints' lives, but in ballads, gossip, superstition, the quiet archive of the kitchen and the tavern, the oral tradition that remembers what official history forgets. Tonight, you're tuning your ear to that hidden music. Across medieval Europe, stories circulated about bad wives who left, though bad often just meant brave. And while these tales were framed as cautionary, they didn't always feel that way. Sometimes they felt like warnings to men, sometimes like winks to women. In the Netherlands, there's a ballad about the miller's wife who flees to sea with a sailor after hiding a dowry of coins under the floorboards. Her husband searches for her for years, only to return home and find she sent back his boots, stuffed with thorns. In France, there's a tale of Isabeau the Quiet, who said nothing for a decade, then one morning packed a satchel, kissed her son, and walked to a convent where she lived out her life, painting illuminated margins, adding tiny, hidden images of women kicking men off horses. In England, the Runaway Bride of Kent became a pub name, a cautionary verse, and a folk hero. Her tale varies. Sometimes she fled to join a troupe of actors. Sometimes she became a nun. Sometimes she turned into a swan. In every version, she refuses the marriage bed, and in every version, she smiles as she leaves. You realize the people who sang these songs remembered, even if the names were changed, even if the details blurred, the essence remained. A woman walked away, and she lived. Historians still argue whether these songs reflect real cases or fantasies. Some suggest they were invented by men to warn against female defiance. Others believe they came from women, passed hand to hand like bread, reshaped in the mouths of grandmothers and nurses. You're inclined to believe the women, because the details feel too real. The mud on the hem, the coin hidden in a loaf of bread, the ribbon cut in half and worn as a token. You start listening more carefully. In the marketplace, a butcher's apprentice hums a verse about a wife who cursed her husband's ale until the barrel soured. A barmaid tells a joke about a woman who ran off with a monk and started a cider mill. A grandmother sings lullabies that end with women rowing boats alone across moonlit rivers. They don't all end happily, but they end on her terms. You think of how many lives like yours aren't carved into tombs or stitched into banners, but live on in fragments. A line in a song, a name scratched into a pew, a whisper shared between cousins while peeling potatoes. So you begin to record them, not formally, just bits and pieces, notes in the margin of your psalter, verses half remembered, sketches of women with baskets and knives and faraway eyes. You become a quiet archivist of forgotten courage, and in time, you add your own story. It's not dramatic, no disguises, no swans, no poisoned soup, just a woman who got tired, who asked for mercy, who took what she had and made something out of the scraps, who didn't die of shame, who grew herbs, who laughed again, who held her friend's hand when she decided to leave. And someday, maybe someone will sing about you. Maybe a girl at a spinning wheel will hum a tune about a wife who didn't stay. Maybe she'll smile without knowing why. Maybe she'll feel less alone, because stories, like seeds, don't care where they fall. They just grow where they're needed. No one remembers her name. Not the priest, not the town scribe, not even the steward who once collected her husband's taxes. Her house is empty now, half swallowed by ivy, its shutters hanging like loose teeth. But if you walk the footpath behind the orchard, just where the woods begin, you'll find the remnants of a herb garden, a stone bench, a rusted cooking pot, and a broken buckle, buried shallow in the soil. She left. No records, no petition, no pilgrimage pass. Just a woman-shaped gap in the parish register and a trail of rumors curling like smoke. Some say she ran with a merchant caravan. Others say she drowned herself in the mill pond. One old woman insists she turned into a hare and now lives near the standing stones, But you think she chose silence, because sometimes the most powerful act isn't going to court or faking madness. It's disappearing so fully that your absence becomes its own legend. There are no ballads about her, no stained glass saints, but her story lingers in gaps, in pauses, in the way women glance toward the woods when they think no one's looking. You hear a younger girl ask, "Didn't she take a child with her?" And another whispers, "Just the smallest one." Someone else adds, "She took the cat too." And you think, good, because not every ending is meant to be documented. Some are meant to be lived. You start noticing more of these silences, the names scratched out of old baptism books, the wife of entries with no death date, the embroidery patterns passed hand to hand, no longer decorative, but maps, codes, a flower for patience, a knot for escape, a bird for vanishing. Historians still argue whether these women existed or were invented to explain their own disappearance. But what they forget is that every story starts as a gap in someone else's certainty. And these women were experts in gaps. Some slipped into other towns, remarried quietly, called themselves widows. Others joined wandering preachers or found work in abbeys too understaffed to ask questions. A few started over under new names, trading silence for safety and fading gracefully into the background. You understand them now, not because you vanished, but because you once wanted to. And part of you still does. Just a little. To walk without fear. To live without definition. To plant something that's yours alone, without asking permission or pardon. And yet, you stayed. You built something here. Quietly. Patiently. A home with sturdy walls and books beneath the floorboards. A life that didn't need to disappear to be real. But still, you remember her. The one who left. The one whose face is gone from memory but who lingers in posture, in footsteps, in stories that begin with, "She just couldn't bear it anymore." You find yourself lighting a candle for her sometimes, not because she died, but because she dared. And when a woman comes to you in the market, eyes wide and lips chapped, holding a baby and nothing else, you press something into her hand, a ribbon, a scrap of bread, a direction, and you say only, "There was another, you'll find your own way." Because not every woman walks into history. Some walk out of it. And in doing so, they carve space for the rest of us. So now, you're lying in bed. The blankets are soft around your shoulders. The room is still. You can hear the quiet tick of something, maybe a distant clock, or maybe just your own breath, slowed by the weight of what you've just heard. The stories have settled now. The queens, the tavern wives, the scribes and spinners and silent ones, all of them have faded into the dark, leaving only a kind of warmth behind. Not comfort, exactly, but clarity. You didn't know so many women walked away. You didn't know how much noise they made, even in silence. And now, you carry their names, or the spaces where their names used to be. You carry the ballads, the court records, the laughter beneath the tree, the bruises that healed, the footprints that led somewhere no one expected. And it's okay if you're not sure what to do with all of that, just yet. You don't have to write a thesis or light a torch or kick down a door. Not tonight. Tonight, you just let yourself rest. Because knowing these stories is a kind of revolution too. And somewhere, maybe a village away, maybe 100 years back, a woman just like you is standing barefoot in a doorway, thinking, "I could go." And you, wrapped in quiet now, whisper back, "You can." So let the air cool around you. Let your shoulders sink deeper into the mattress. Let your hands unclench, your thoughts drift. You've walked far tonight, across continents and centuries and countless thresholds. You deserve to rest. And when you wake, may you carry these stories with softness, with strength, with just enough fire to keep your own name alight. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.